So let me ask you guys, have you ever looked through somebody else's prescription glasses that were not made for your eyes? Or have you ever looked through binoculars or a telescope that did not have a properly adjusted lens? Now, having the right lenses in the right place, adjusted in the correct way, is critical to seeing the world correctly, right? And the same really applies for how we read Scripture. We need the right lens in the right place. There's a right way to read and interpret Scripture, and there's a wrong way to read and interpret Scripture. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. But as followers of Jesus Christ, we need to do our best to get as close to the truth as we possibly can. Now, if you are leading Bible studies, if you're one of our growth group leaders, or even just in your personal study, there are two things that you really need to get right when you're reading the Bible. First of all, you need to understand exegesis, and secondly, you need to understand hermeneutics. Now, exegesis really just involves looking carefully at what the text says. So you're looking at grammar, you're looking at syntax, you're looking at the structure of the passage, you're looking at the biblical language in its context to try to understand the meaning of the passage. That's exegesis. Now, the second thing we've got to get right, we want to do well, is hermeneutics. And that has to do with interpretation. That's all really what it is. It's an aspect, or maybe there's some overlap, you could say, between the exegesis and the biblical hermeneutics. So one of the biggest, I think, just most significant obstacles to reading Scripture well is the philosophical, the political, and even the cultural baggage that we bring to the text when we're reading it. And let me just give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. Now, recently I was reading in the book of Acts with some people, and we're looking at chapters 2 and 4 in particular, and in Acts 2 and 4, we read about how the early church, early Christians, were sharing their belongings. They were selling their possessions. They were showing hospitality to one another. And so it's really easy to read socialism into the text. And I've heard people do this. They'll say, oh, well, Paul or Luke or whoever's writing these biblical passages is talking about socialism. Well, we need to keep in mind that socialism is a 19th century atheistic political philosophy rooted in Karl Marx's philosophical ideas. So again, we need to go back and understand that. We're reading certain modern ideas into the biblical text, and we need to be careful about that. Another example I come across sometimes is in the Apostle Paul's writings to the church in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about the role of women in ministry in the church. And so a lot of people will cringe at what Paul says because it doesn't sound right to our modern ears, right? So why is it that we cringe at those passages? Why is it that we have such a hard time with those texts? Well, could it be that, again, we are imposing 21st century philosophical and cultural ideas having to do with the sexual revolution, or second or third wave feminism, or even certain modern laws having to do with gender equality? Maybe we're imposing those things on the passage. So that's where I'm saying we've got to check our philosophical baggage. We've got to look at hermeneutics carefully. We want to read the text in its original context, not imposing this incorrect lens on our reading of Scripture. So as you guys are reading Scripture, as you're studying Scripture together, keep these things in mind. We want to have good exegesis. We want to have good hermeneutics. We're not always going to get it right. That's the reality. We're not going to get it right every time, but we want to do our best to get as close to the truth as possible.